Hello everyone and good evening and welcome to Tudor Talk with me, Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide. So good to see a couple of you joining live, and maybe some folk will be joining us along the way. I know it's a while since I've been here actually, so it's great to be back. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of the most prominent families of the Tudor age, and that is of course the Boleyn family, but not the later Boleyns. We are going to be focusing on the rise of the Boleyns with our guest speaker today, Dr. Claire Martin. However, in the meantime, just let me say that do let me know who's in the house tonight. I can see Laurie, you're here. So good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us live. And please, say hello. Let me know who's here and where you are in the world. And of course, remember that once we get into the chat, you are most welcome to ask Claire your own questions. All you need to do is type them into the comments section, and hopefully I'll be able to pick them up. And I will put as many, if not all of your questions, I hope, to Claire during the course of our time together. And speaking of time, as you know, we take as long as it takes. However, I tend to keep it to 1 hour, so that'll be our maximum amount of time together, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to cover a lot of ground in that time. Okay, my friends, so with that, let me introduce our guest speaker today. So, as I said, we have Dr. Claire Martin, and Claire is a writer and historian and a professional archival researcher, which I'm very envious of. We've just been having a chat before we came on live, talking about Latin and secretary hand, and it's something I would love to be able to do. So I'm incredibly envious. Claire studied at Oxford, but most importantly for us, of course, in 2023, i.e. last year, Claire published her first book, Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns, focusing on the rise of the Boleyn family. So without further ado, as they say, let me bring Claire up onto the stage. Hello, Claire. Welcome to Tudor Talk.
Hello, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. So, and I know there's going to be lots to talk about. We have been deep in this subject recently, so I feel warmed up actually, because as some people may or may not know, we're doing this online digital course around Anne Boleyn, and Claire was our first speaker. So I have been privileged to get a little bit of a preview of some of your extensive knowledge of the early Boleyns, but I look forward to unpacking some of it. And I hope, guys, that you will, as I say, come with your own questions. And I just noticed we have BA, hello in Sweden, lovely, and Annette is joining us from Bournemouth, and you're a first timer. Oh, well, you're very welcome, Annette. You're very welcome indeed. Okay, Claire, hello. Now. First of all, let's just get a little bit of background out of the way. How did you come to be studying the early Boleyns?
So I came to study the Boleyns because my PhD and my first interest was actually not the Tudor court or Tudor history really at all. My specialism is medieval London. So I got interested in the family because there, as we will talk about, I'm sure, there is a particular member of the early generations of the Boleyns called Geoffrey Boleyn, who was a Londoner and who made a lot of their money. So I was intrigued to find this famous family name really focused amongst the merchants and the Londoners that I was familiar with. And so then I looked into it a bit more, and I found that what had been written on the family hadn't really made use of the very rich records, the surviving medieval records of the City of London. And I thought, oh, there's a lot more that can be said here about that particular part of their story.
Ah, interesting. I love the way you kind of accidentally fell into this through your other research. That's brilliant. Now, I want to tackle, first of all, I think one of those things that comes up time and time again, and it's about the name Boleyn. And I've seen all sorts of theories postulated about where the name comes from, where the Boleyns might have originated. So I've got two questions for you. Mm-hmm. Where did the Boleyns originate from? Is it Norfolk or somewhere a little bit more exotic? And that could be linked to any myths or legends around the name Boleyn. So where does Boleyn come from? Do we have any idea?
So The short answer is we don't know for certain, and there have been, as you say, various theories and stories put forward over the years. One is that the name originates with Boulogne in France, and then linked to that, it's been suggested that they were somehow connected to Eustace of Boulogne, one of the knights of the Norman conquest. But I think what's important to understand is that these are quite old theories, and they come from a period of history where I think writers were looking for some sort of more noble, aristocratic, rather more socially elevated explanation of how the Boleyns came to be where they were. In reality, I don't think there's much truth behind that, because as I went back in the family, you find them as tenants, free peasant tenants rather than unfree peasants, but living on a manor in Norfolk. And really, if you're part of the entourage of a knight coming over with the Norman conquest, you're quite high status, and these people generally ended up owning land and being quite prominent. You don't come and become a peasant. That's not how the trajectory of people work. The other side of that is that since these theories were put forward, the amount of research that historians have done into the middle classes and into London society in particular has expanded hugely. And now we know that there were quite a lot of families who were able to go from peasants into the gentry and work their way up through London or other means. And so we don't really need a more aristocratic or immigrant explanation of what they achieved, because there were plenty of other people following the same path.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned peasant farmers, free and non-free. And actually, I think this might be a really good time, if you could, to describe to us what the different kind of strata of Tudor society were. So you've got like
we need to go back a little bit, because these sort of things have broken down by the Tudor period. You didn't really have free or unfree people. Pretty much all peasants have become free by that point.
Right.
But if we go back into the 13th century and earlier, and the 14th century, when the early generations of the Boleyns were living, although that change is beginning to happen, there were still people who were born free as free peasants. So they could, for example, leave their manor if they wanted to, whereas unfree tenants couldn't. And they owed different suits, different sort of fees and services that they were required to pay to their manorial lord. And unfree peasants could not rent or own through the manor free land. They could only own unfree land, whereas the Boleyns were free and they could rent either.
Right.
So it was a much more restricted life, but they weren't unfree in the sense of slaves. They weren't owned by their manorial lords. They were tied to the land. So they were sort of like part of the chattels of the manor, if you like.
Gosh, I'm sure. I mean, maybe that's going too far off the subject of tonight, but I think that's fascinating how that came about. What would be really interesting to explore. But I think I'm just going to park that, because I want.
For now, the Boleyns were free, so they didn't have that burden to get out from underneath of.
So when we come across the very first Boleyns, who are the names that come up, and where are they on the kind of pecking order? Because I think I've heard you mention yeoman farmers, which is yet another kind of layer of society. And it'd be really interesting to know, where are you first seeing the Boleyns, and what does that actually mean about where they were in society at the time?
So if you imagine a medieval village society, yeoman farmers would be at the top of that. So they own a more extensive amount of farming land, but they are still farming. And they don't generally own a whole manor themselves. Once you own one manor, you've kind of crossed the border into what historians would call the gentry. Right. Although I will throw that word around, and you'll hear a lot of other historians throwing that word around. It wasn't used in the medieval period at all. It's a much later word, but it's very convenient to neatly describe the number of people who owned manors and took their income from the rental income of that manor, or from selling some of the produce that their peasant farmers produced on their behalf, but weren't titled. They weren't aristocracy. They might be knights. So those are the gentry. They are the landed middle classes, if you like. Yeoman farmers were on the border below that, but things can get quite blurry in this middle part of society. To confuse things, you have merchants and lawyers in this middle area as well. This middle ground is where the Boleyns are operating quite a lot of the time. But to get back to your question, when we first come across the Boleyns, they're not yeoman farmers. So they're living in a village in Norfolk called Saul, pronounced Saul, spelt S-A-L-L-E.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you for clarifying that, because I heard you say that the other day, and I was like, noted, because I've been calling it.
I think that's right. I was told that by somebody else, so I'm running with it.
Okay, because it looks like Sal, doesn't it? You would put,
like Sal.
Yeah, but it's Saul. Yeah. Okay, right. Okay,
Saul. Good. And Norfolk at this stage is a very important county economically. Norfolk is one of the most important cities after London, and it's very heavily populated. So we're at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century now. And generally that meant that people had very small bits of land, so not enough land that a family could support themselves just from what they could grow and produce. And in the village in particular, in Saul, where the Boleyns are living, you can see in the manorial records who the more prominent families are, their names appear again and again, and lots of property transactions. The Boleyns at this stage are not in that group. So they're there, they're renting small amounts of land, and they're on the way up.
Right, okay. Now, I've got a quick question from Annette, who's, I can pull this onto the screen. Was Boleyn spelt the same? So that's a good question, actually, isn't it? Because spelling...
The answer is yes, sometimes, but not always. So the conventional spelling that we use today was used in the medieval period, but it's also commonly spelt B-U-L-L-E-N, B-O-L-L-E-N, or very occasionally, and when the scribe didn't really know the people and was clearly slightly confused, B-O-L-L-I-N-G.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. But the most common spelling is B-U-L-L-E-N. So it sounded like bull.
Yeah, Boleyn. Boleyn? Would that be more of Boleyn? Yeah. I mean, that sounds much more English, doesn't it? Boleyn. So yes. do we think that as the family became more wealthy, that they might have... We've got a TV series, haven't we, in the UK, where, what's her name? Mrs. Bouquet. She's actually spelled bucket. But she likes to pretend that she's more upper class than she is. So rather than pronouncing her name Bucket, she says Bouquet. I mean, is this what the Boleyns did? Did they kind of... had a bit of flair?
You can see the different spellings, and they occur here and there, and they change. I can't see a progression from one to the other. So no, I don't think they were doing that. It's just that there was no conventional spelling. And you spelt different ways depending on who was writing it and how they thought that they would render the sound that they were hearing when people said it out loud. And the Boleyns did later on choose bulls' heads as their arms, which is known as canting arms. It's a pun on the sound of their name. So they didn't want to make it sound more Frenchified. They were quite happy with the bull sound.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you said something earlier that was quite interesting to me about the fact that gentry is a term we've invented, historians have invented. So what, just to be clear, what would the people of the time call that class? Those landed people who owned manors and owned land but weren't nobility?
Well, this is something that really intrigued me, and the introduction to my book really examines how people were looking at class in this period. So the thinking about society, the sort of theories that people wrote at the time about how society was structured, was divided into the three estates. So people that fought, which would be the landed classes who provided knights and the armies for the king. people who prayed, so everybody in the church, and then people who worked, so craftsmen and farmers. So they didn't actually see a group in the middle. If you owned land and you took income from your ownership of that land rather than having to work with your hands to get your income, then you were in the group who fought. Okay. And they, as a whole, would call that group noble or gentle. Okay. So they didn't want to distinguish between dukes and earls at the top of that and people further down. They saw themselves as one identity. Obviously they knew that a duke is higher up but they saw themselves as having one identity.
That's interesting. I had no idea about that. And guys, you let me know in the comments, was that news to you? Because that's very interesting. Okay, and now you also mentioned lawyers and merchants, and I think that's going to become relevant to our story because that's kind of where the Boleyns go next. Can you tell us about the transition then between their origins as peasant farmers, yeoman farmers, and how they made that switch into the working class, right? They became working.
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
So they basically, after the Black Death, when there were less people around and more land available, they started to get more land. They bought land and they were renting more land from their manorial lord. That is when they get up to the level of what you would call yeoman farmers. But now things get a bit more ambitious and a bit faster because now you have enough money to get a foot in the door, maybe with an Oxford degree or a place at the Inns of Court to study law, or in the Boleyns case, an apprenticeship in London. And this is where people then rapidly accelerate their social progression if they are successful. So we have two men called Geoffrey Boleyn. The elder one is the yeoman farmer, and he sends his younger son, Geoffrey Boleyn, up to London to serve an apprenticeship with a man who was a hatter. That was his trade. But hatters were not just men who worked with their hands and made hats. And Geoffrey's master was a man called Adam Book, who was probably himself an immigrant from the Low Countries. And he was a merchant, and that's where you made a lot of money, and why I say they weren't workers. He wasn't working with his hands. He was trading and being a businessman, importing stuff, exporting stuff, lending money to other people, also to the crown. And he was very successful at that. And then he went on and joined one of the most powerful guild in medieval London called the Mercers, who were cloth merchants. And the basis of their trade was exporting cloth that was woven in England to the Low Countries to be finished and importing principally linen, but also a huge amount of other what was known as small wares. And we have records of Geoffrey importing things like straw hats in the summer and woolen hats in the winter, and things like laces for your clothes, combs, and all sorts of other small goods. And he built up a hugely successful business and started the Boleyns on their rise up to great fortunes.
Yeah. So he is a businessman. He sounds very entrepreneurial. He sounds like he was, had the eye on what people needed, typical entrepreneur really of the period.
Yes.
So he's in London and he's being successful in his business. He's accumulating money. I've got a couple of questions. What happens to him, basically? Where does he go in his career? But also, I'm very well aware that the Boleyns became prosperous back in Norfolk as well, and perhaps we'll talk about some of their properties in that area. So the money obviously came back into Norfolk as well. Did he come back to Norfolk, or did he just sort of ship the money back? What happened there?
So he gets married to a lady named Anne who was the daughter of Lord Who and Hastings, and that's where the family gets the name Anne from. And they have a number of children together, 2 sons and 3 daughters. And once he's got 2 sons, you can see Geoffrey now later on in his career with more capital that he's made, think, right, my sons are not going to stay in London. A few London families stayed generation after generation of merchants in London, but a lot, once they made the money, wanted their families to become gentry, to own manors, to own land, and to live a different style of life. But to do that, they had to own the manors and the land and the houses rather than promissory notes and coins. It's that you needed that landed income to qualify to be a knight of the shire, to sit in parliament and so forth, to get that status.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Can I just interrupt? Sorry, that was really interesting. So in order to be a politician, to sit in parliament, you had to own property and land.
You didn't if you were sitting for a borough. So Geoffrey was an MP while he was in London as a Londoner. But to represent a county, you had to be a landowner in that county.
Right, okay, great.
So Geoffrey really, he remains a Londoner for all of his life, although he does go back to Norfolk, and we can talk about the property he bought there. There are brilliant records of how much time Londoners spent in London if they were aldermen, because we have records of how often they attended the meetings of the Court of Aldermen, which was London's governing council. So we can tell, he wasn't attending meetings for quite a long time here. Maybe that means he's not in London over this period. And so in the later part of his life, he's obviously not in London from sort of late summer, around September, later summer and into September, October, November, which was the plague period of the year. So he's going out to Norfolk, and then, but the rest of the time he's back in London, and he does die in London as a Londoner. That's really, and he describes himself in his will as a Londoner, not as a gentleman of Norfolk.
Okay. And how old is he when he dies? I want to get a feeling of how, do we know how old he was?
He died in 1463. We don't know exactly when he was born, but it was very early in the century. So he's late 50s, maybe 60, so which was the average age for a rich Londoner to die.
Yeah. So he's had a good long length of time, really, to build up a career and to build up wealth and status. And so he uses some of that wealth and status to start buying property in Norfolk. Let's talk about what Boleyn properties we know exist in Norfolk.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing he buys is a manor very close to Saul. And he later talks about how expensive it was and how frustrated that this was, for once in his life, not a good deal. But he clearly really wanted it because it was close to Saul. So he could go back there. Now I've made all my money, and the people who knew my family before can see me as a new self-made lord of the manor. So he buys Blickling, which was a small 14th century manor house when he acquired it, and he did extensive building work, building what was probably a large second courtyard extension and making the small house into a much, much larger house. And he also buys a whole load of other manors in Norfolk from which the intention was that he would take the income. So not intending to live on them, he was living in Norfolk at Blickling, but taking the income from those manors. Right. And his plan was that he would then bequeath them to his eldest son, Thomas.
Okay. And so that's the kind of the country seat, really. So you've got your London base, your thriving business, you've now got your country seat in Norfolk. Now, I'm going to ask her quickly before I go on, because I want to talk about the Norwich property that I know you and I were having a quick chat, but I wanted, because I think this is the time to ask a question from Laurie. I'm wondering if the majority of the merchant class at the time of Geoffrey's rise were mainly new money or had some inherited their wealth from their ancestors.
So it's a really good question. And it is a bit of a mix. So some were like the Boleyns, new money. So they were yeoman peasant, well, not peasant, but yeoman families with a bit of money behind them, because there was a fee to start an apprenticeship in London. So you did need enough money to get your son in there, and you needed the connections. So some were like that, like the Boleyns. But also quite a lot were the younger sons of already established lower gentry families. So a family where they would pass their property on to their eldest son, but the younger ones had to make their way by some other means in the church, in the law, or going to London and an apprentice. So a bit of both.
I always thought that was brutal for the the eldest getting everything, and the younger ones, particularly in big families, they're just like left with virtually nothing.
Well, we must also talk about what Geoffrey did in that regard, because he didn't do that. We can
Yes,
come
well,
maybe onto
yeah,
that later,
well,
but so
yeah.
he had a younger son, William, for whom he bought a castle, Hever Castle in Kent, which is not bad as a younger son. So he was also acquiring property in London, the house they lived in, and other property in London. And then he bought 2 other manors and Hever Castle in Kent, with the intention of leaving them to his younger son, so that they both had a start for a new gentry life, but in separate counties where they wouldn't be in competition with each other for the top spots in their respective counties. So he
I
was
mean,
planning for both of his sons.
yeah, and the fact that he was planning that and he did that says something about his character, but also
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
but the properties that you mention as well. I mean, that also tells us of the extreme wealth that he generated.
Yes.
I mean, he
So
was
when he
super
died,
successful.
he was unbelievably successful. Yes. So a lot of people come up to London, they start apprenticeships, they're moderately successful. But something like only 10% manage to make enough money to buy one manor. And Geoffrey, but I can't even count how many he buys. And he buys a massive stately home and a castle.
Yeah.
So he was right at the top. Only a very small number made it to be as successful as he was. So he was incredibly successful. And his will includes cash bequests of around £5,500, which is about 2.8 million today.
And you've just reminded me of something, because I'm currently, I was just talking to you about the fact I've just finished writing up the 1502 Progress. And one of the things that Henry VII was really good at was schmoozing with people who had lots of money, because often getting loans from them. And he did that with the wool merchants of the Cotswolds. And that triggered a memory that Henry VII, I think, visited Blickling.
Yes,
so
he
was
did.
that Geoffrey, or was that one of Geoffrey's
No,
sons?
that
Would
was
be his
long
sons,
after
wouldn't it?
Geoffrey's death. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it wasn't even Geoffrey's son, actually.
Oh,
It was Geoffrey's son was still alive, but he probably wasn't there at that time. It was probably Geoffrey's grandson, Thomas, so Anne Boleyn's father, who
father.
was there. He was still a very young man who hadn't really started his career yet, but he was there to
Yeah.
receive Henry VII when he arrived. And I started to wonder why. And I looked at a few other families who were on that same progress. And I found at least 1, possibly 2 other cases where there was a young son who was at the beginning of his career and father stepped back. And it was he who received the king. So this was obviously a chance to put your son forward and hope that he's able to make something of the opportunity.
So cycling back to Geoffrey, very rich man, he would have garnered a lot of attention in London. Do we know if he had any links with the court? Who would have been king? Henry VI,
and then he dies very shortly into the reign of Henry IV. So he's in that very violent transition period.
Yeah.
Generally, London merchants didn't get too involved, but the city did open the gates to Edward IV. And then after that, they were kind of thrown in their lot with the Yorkist side. But as what we know about Geoffrey's specific involvement is that once Edward IV is on the throne, he grants to Geoffrey what was a quite common exemption from various royal offices, like having to be sheriff or serving on juries. And the grant, normally you could buy this, you would pay a fee for it, and he had done so before. But Edward IV states that he was giving this to him for the good service that Geoffrey had given to his father while he was alive, so to Richard, Duke of York. Now, we don't know what this good service was, or even if it was, anything that significant, or whether that was just the polite phrasing. But Geoffrey was a very rich man. And he had other Yorkist connections, friends who were clearly Yorkist, even before Edward IV was on the throne. So the most likely service that he performed for Richard, Duke of York, is lending him money.
Yeah. And could we say that they were a Yorkist family during the Wars of the Roses, or did they just seem to
the Londoners were
adapt?
They were kind of, their political opinions were often kept under the table. The most important thing, particularly for a man like Geoffrey, who is alderman and mayor, London just wants peace. Like most businessmen and merchants, they just want a stable economy where they can carry on with
Yeah.
their business without politics getting in the way. So London tries to sit on the fence for most of the Wars of the Roses.
Right.
But obviously those men also had their personal opinions.
Yeah.
So I think Geoffrey, his personal opinion, he probably leaned towards the Yorkists, certainly by the second half of the 1450s.
Yeah.
But as a London leader, he was sitting on the fence.
Okay, all right. Very interesting. I haven't asked that question before, so I never even thought about it. What side were the Boleyns on, back in the depths of the Wars of Roses? Now, going back to properties, we talked about Blickling a bit. Actually, we just should finish up on Blickling. I don't want to get too distracted.
Yes.
Because you go to see Blickling today. Thankfully, Blickling Hall is still there. And then you get very disappointed because the National Trust tell you that it was built by Hobart, I think it was.
Henry Hobart, yeah.
Later. And you're like, but then since then, I have definitely heard from a number of different sources that there is more of the Boleyn family home there than we might have originally considered. So what do we know? What don't we know? What can we say about how much of the Boleyns manor still remains at Blickling?
I think it's not necessarily visible in a sense that when you go there, you're not really getting a sense of what the Boleyns' home would have looked like, because Henry Hobart, rather than building a new home in the sense of knocking down one and building another, what he actually did was a very extensive renovation project. So the building accounts for what he did do survive, and they record things like moving walls, putting up new facades, building turrets on the corners, changing the layout of the rooms and staircases, and all the sort of things we do when we're renovating a house. But the bones of the house, in the sense of it being a 2-courtyard house with a smaller courtyard at the front and a much larger courtyard at the back, that is the house that the Boleyns would have known.
Right, okay. So the essential footprint is probably the same, but...
Yes, I think there are probably some elements of brickwork, like this wall here is like Tudor brickwork, but yeah, so that there is physical parts of the Boleyns' house there, but it doesn't necessarily look like the Boleyns' house, if you see what I mean.
I do. Okay, we're about halfway through, so I just thought I'd pause for a moment and welcome people who've arrived since the beginning of our chat. I'm talking to Claire Martin, who has written a book called The Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns. And actually, Kim was asking, we're going to talk about the book at the end, but Kim was asking, will The Heirs of Ambitions be available in the US as an ebook or an audible book? So perhaps quickly you could just answer that. So
I hope so, but I apparently need a new agent.
Okay.
I'm not making much progress.
Okay.
So I hope so. I intend to keep working on that, but it's not happening at the moment.
Okay.
But you can ship from UK suppliers like Blackwell's to the US. They will ship it for you.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Right. So we will come back to the book at the end again, just to wrap things up. But we're talking about the rise of the Boleyns. We're really putting the early Boleyns under the microscope and trying to understand how they did this incredible leap from being free peasant farmers to the very pinnacle of Tudor society. And certainly Geoffrey Boleyn seems to be a key part of this equation. Mm-hmm. Would you say he's the most important Boleyn?
Yes, without him, they would have never got anywhere near it. Yeah. If it wasn't him, it needed to be another generation of the family that made this leap. Other families do it via the law, so it could have been via a career as a lawyer. But if it wasn't him, it needed to be somebody else to do that that speedy trajectory. Otherwise, it would have taken like many generations longer.
Yeah. If at all. So, if at all. Now, what I was trying to come to, back to the property thing, was I did visit Norwich last year for the first time. And I had a good old sniff around the cathedral and the old town, and then went down King Street, where if you go, and some of you might have seen, I've actually got a video on YouTube, so don't go now, but if you're interested, I did Tudor Boleyn treasures, I think I call it, of Norwich. You could probably search Norwich and the Tudor Travel Guide in YouTube, and it'll probably come up, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. There is a very dilapidated house on a part of Norwich which now is fairly deserted, isn't it? I mean, but it wasn't always like that. This was, well, tell us more about this building and why it's important, Claire.
So it's on King Street next to a much better preserved building of the same period called Dragon Hall, which was built as a merchant emporium for displaying merchant wares, and behind it's on King Street, but it backs onto the river. So the ships could come up to the river and unload their goods. And then adjoining that were other merchants' houses benefiting from the same river access. But by the time the Boleyns were there, that merchant aspect had faded away a bit, and those houses had become more prestigious, wealthy gentry or mercantile families living in them. For example, just down the road is a house owned by the Paston family, who are famous to medievalists because they left a lot of surviving letters, which we very rarely have. And they were another Norfolk family who made themselves rich, in this case, through the law. So you get more of these middle-class gentry families living on the street. But the Boleyns acquired it actually after Geoffrey's death. His widow, Anne, who was left a very wealthy woman but chose not to remarry, and whose main home was at Blickling, although she also, we know, spent time in London and kept a home together in London. She acquired that house from, I think it was her uncle on her parents' side, not the Boleyn side, so the Who side, her mother's side, I think. So I think he was called Edmund Witchingham, but he had heirs of his own, so she didn't inherit it. So I think she must have bought it in her widowhood in order to have a base in Norwich. Because if you imagine you're a wealthy widow of the gentry class with all these lovely houses in the countryside, you have a son who's going to grow up and inherit that property. And now what do you do with yourself? You're like the unwanted third wheel in your son's house, particularly if he's going to get married and have a family of his own, or you get shoved off into a smaller house and you have to be there on your own and you never see anybody apart from your servants. So quite often widows in this position liked to live more in towns or cities where they could be more part of a community. And actually, Geoffrey's son, William, when he died, his widow was left money to decide where she would want to live. And she also bought a house in Norwich. And I think this choice to be more city living is the reason that Geoffrey's widow, Anne, is buried in Norwich Cathedral.
Yes, that is fascinating. I had absolutely no idea about that. How long did they keep their house? Do we know how long it remained in the Boleyn family?
I do, but not off the top of my head. Not for a huge amount of time. So by the time Anne Boleyn is around, they no longer have it.
They no longer own it.
William owned it, and then they sold it after that.
Right. Okay. Now, Ellen was asking: is same Blickling Hall of code breaking in World War II?
That's Bletchley Park.
Yeah. So different B, Ellen, a different B, and in a very different part of the country. Well. So it's an interesting place because it's you go down to see this place and it's in rack and ruin, isn't it? And you're like,
oh, it's such a disappointment. And it's got a modern shop unit on the bottom, which isn't, even if you're looking for a modern shop unit, it's in a terrible state. Yeah. And then there's the old timber framing on the top, but all sort of patched up. So yeah, it's you think with the Boleyn connection it might be a bit more loved, but it is in a sorry state at the moment.
But you were just telling me there potentially are finally plans to maybe look after this building, because I've been so worried about this place. I keep thinking, whoa, no, what's happening? But
it's been a while since I heard about that, so I'm not sure what the current state of the planning application is, but there certainly is a proposal from a developer to look after it and hopefully sympathetically turn the old part of the building into flats, and then there's a large area at the back where they will build more. But it needs somebody to find it a modern purpose, to do something that is going to enable it to survive, or it's just not going to be there anymore.
And to love it again. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well let's, and who, we should mention, actually, this would be a good time to ask about tombs to do with the Boleyns. Because obviously we have this plethora of Norfolk-based Boleyns. We've talked about some London-based folk. Who can we go and see? Are there any tombs left? And who, if so, who?
So you can...
You see that?
No pun intended. And who then became Anne Boleyn, is buried in Norwich Cathedral. Her gravestone, sadly, no longer has the brasses that would have been inlaid into it. Norwich suffered terribly in the Civil War, and a lot of the brasses were all dragged out of the cathedral and melted down outside. So it's not even in its proper place anymore, sadly. So it hasn't even got her body underneath it. But you can go and see it. And then her son was buried also in Norwich Cathedral, on the south side of the presbytery in an archway. So you can go and see the site, but annoyingly, his tomb did survive all the way up into roughly the middle of the 19th century, and the Victorians ripped it out.
I can't...
Why? I think because it was sitting in the archway on top of a chantry chapel, which was already in the archway, but accessed from the lower floor level of the ambulatory, as it's called, the corridor that goes around the outside of the cathedral. So it was a very high up tomb, and the presbytery floor was much higher. And then there were steps up to the tomb. And then what happened in the 19th century is they lowered the presbytery floor to the level it is now. So if you imagine you've got William's tomb up in a very high position in this archway with steps that now end in midair. So they were... So I think what happened probably is at that point they thought, oh, look, we're just going to take all this down because now it looks ridiculous. It's higher than the high altar. So I think it was probably removed at that point. There were possibly also structural things because it was a stone altar tomb sitting on top of a vault of another chapel. I don't know how it was able to support the weight.
Hey. So do we know where their bodies actually are?
No.
No.
No. So they would probably be somewhere within the cathedral precincts because, you know, we're still living in a very Christian period in the middle of the 19th century. They wouldn't have just chucked the bones out. So they were probably reburied there somewhere, but we don't know where.
Right. Okay. and while we're talking about those tombs, if you go and stand in front of the high altar and just look up around kind of the apse, you'll see lots of Boleyn coats of arms, won't you? Which means
and those were most by William and Anne.
So were they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Probably mostly by Anne, because there's only a few that show William's arms with his wife, who was Margaret Butler. So probably mostly Anne.
Right. And was it Geoffrey's lifetime when they first got their kind of coat of arms?
Yes. So he had got the arm. We don't have there are very few records of grants of arms, but yes. He was the one who London merchants quite liked to do that.
Yes.
Because that's that overlap between I'm a merchant, but actually I'm part of the knightly class. So particularly at the end of the 15th century, there was an awful lot of borrowing of knightly culture going on in London. Companies were getting their own arms, and instead of the traditional images of heraldry, they were putting things like spades and the tools of their trade on their arms. So a lot of London was wanting to borrow the culture of the knightly class.
Yeah, lovely. And tell us a bit about, I mean, I know we've maybe going back a little bit, but Anne Who is quite an interesting woman, isn't she? She was a bit of wasn't she quite a formidable woman?
I think she was a very capable woman. Geoffrey left her full control of his property income and his children, so he clearly trusted her. And she also seems to have carried on some of his mercantile business, which was not uncommon for widows of London citizens. So 10 years after Geoffrey's death, there's a record of a gentleman from Cornwall who owed £600 to Anne with two of her sons-in-law, and it specifically says for merchandise he had purchased in London. So she was still trading in goods. And she quite deftly sorts out what was quite a complicated inheritance from her father. She had three half-sisters, and rather convoluted set of two wills in her father's family, which left bequests which opposed each other, and dowers and different claims to land. And she used the wealth that Geoffrey had left her to cut through that and to lend money to her half uncle, who was a bit strapped for cash flow. And in return for that, the money that she had lent him, she made sure that he settled on her and William the bits of her father's inheritance that had gone to him temporarily but would come to her. So she got the easy bits and her sisters had to scrap for the rest.
Right, okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Now, I feel we should touch on William, her son, right? Mm-hmm. Father of Thomas, who then, yes, of course, is father of Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn's grandfather, William, right? So that's yes, where we're at, aren't
we? That's right, yeah.
We haven't touched on him, and I think maybe we should spend at least 5 minutes just talking about the man. What do we know of him?
Well, first of all, the most important thing to say about William is that he was their younger son, and he only inherited all of that wealth because his elder brother Thomas died when he was not quite 25, when he was still 24, and probably as a result of wounds sustained fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Barnet, which was fought just outside London. So that it's quite interesting to me to imagine what would have happened if that had not occurred. Yeah. So instead of being a hugely wealthy landowner, as William was, and therefore able to get a great marriage for his son to Elizabeth Howard, the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, he would have been a much smaller, much less prominent landowner. So although he had Hever Castle and a couple of other manors and the property in London, that only was worth about half of what Geoffrey had left to his elder son Thomas. So Thomas would have been the head of the family. Yeah. And Anne Boleyn would have been the granddaughter of the minor branch of the Boleyns. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you about were there any pivotal moments, that changed things? So that's one of them, isn't it? And that I suppose that quite often happened. People died quite young and everything changed.
So commonly in this period, families on the way up ended up with only daughters or no children at all. It was something that stopped a lot of families. So that nearly happened to the Boleyns at that point, but they were lucky to have a spare as well as the heir.
Yeah.
So that could have been very different.
Yeah. Okay, Claire, so William, how old is he when he inherits from his father?
So he was 25 when he inherited. Normally it would be 21, but his children were still quite young when he died. So Geoffrey specified in his will that he didn't know what they were going to turn out like, so they couldn't have the money until they were 25.
Right.
He was already married by then to Margaret Butler, the daughter of Thomas, Earl of Ormond, and a marriage arranged by his mother.
Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was noticing when you were talking about Geoffrey before, how he marries Anne who's got, she's coming from a title. I think it was Lord Who.
Lord, yeah.
And now
not when they married. He became Lord Who later, a couple of years later. But
okay.
he was a much more prominent family, yes.
But still, now we've got William marrying the daughter of an earl. So we're starting to get those connections with the aristocracy coming through now.
Yes, although the Boleyn family, merchants, making good deals, gambling on what would happen. As I say, Anne Who was not actually the daughter of Lord Who and Hastings or his heir. Well, she was his heir when they married, but he was about to remarry, so that could really change. And Thomas Butler was not Earl of Ormond when the Boleyns married into his family. They were under attainder, which meant they'd lost their lands and titles because they were Lancastrians. And Thomas Butler had an elder brother who, even if all that was overturned, his elder brother would become Earl of Ormond, not him. But his elder brother, John, died unmarried, and so Thomas became Earl of Ormond. And so then Margaret was his heir with her sister Anne, because Thomas Butler had no sons. So that gamble paid off. And not only did the Boleyns end up married to the family of an earl, they also inherited half of his estate.
So what I'm seeing here is a fortunate set of circumstances which turn in the Boleyns' favour, and that could have so easily gone in the other direction and meant a
Quite
completely
easily.
different. That's really come through for me in this chat. Okay, so I just want to kind of wrap up our chat because we are coming towards the end of our hour long by just coming back to this next marriage, which is William's son Thomas, of course, Anne Boleyn's, our Anne Boleyn, the famous Anne Boleyn's father. And he makes this another fantastic match with a daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. Do you have an opinion, or do we know how that match was brought about? Because it seems quite a bit of a catch.
It certainly was. That was a big step up. But William already had a long-standing connection with the Dukes of Norfolk. So from before Henry VII was on the throne, when Richard III took the throne, the Boleyns were already associated with the Dukes of Norfolk. The Duke of Norfolk became Admiral of England. He had previously been Deputy Admiral of Norfolk and Suffolk, and he gave that position to William Boleyn. So there was clearly that connection there. He was now working as his deputy.
Right.
But of course, that went all wrong because Richard III and the Duke of Norfolk did not survive the Battle of Bosworth. But this connection clearly survived, and the Howard family get themselves back into their titles and their lands. And I think that is how the Boleyns then found themselves in a position to marry their son to the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, because they were reviving an established connection with the family before their disastrous fall from grace.
Right.
And the Duke of Norfolk actually marries one of his other daughters into the Norfolk gentry. So he was trying to put down roots in Norfolk to make those connections with prominent gentry family, who, as a member of the greater aristocracy, they need these lesser gentry families behind them to provide troops when they need to raise an army, and to provide the power behind their power, if you like. So so he was they're prominent enough in Norfolk that the Duke of Norfolk was interested in him for his daughter.
Very, very interesting. Wow, well, that brings us right up to the Boleyn family that we all know and love, and that's where we are going to close off our conversation. But honestly, I've learned so much today. And this is the second time we've chatted in detail, so thank you so much. We covered some very different ground than the ground we
really
covered the other day, but it's been fascinating. Thank you so much. So I believe you have a copy of your book there. Could you show folk
I do.
your book? There you go. Lovely.
There it is.
That's it. That's it. The Making of the Boleyns. There we go. It's a beautiful cover. Love it, actually.
Isn't it a lovely cover? There's a story behind all of it. The White Tower of London, and the pattern from Anne Boleyn's prayer book or interpretation of, and then we've got Geoffrey, the yeoman farmer with his sheep.
Oh, lovely. Oh, fantastic. I love it. No, I think it's very attractive. Now, just clarify the situation. It's available in the UK, but not directly in the US, but people can order it from the UK.
You can order it from the US, and it's available in Europe, and I think in Canada, because it's Commonwealth rights have been sold. So it is available in other countries, but sadly not the US at the moment.
Okay, that's great. And I also wanted to mention, so folks, grab yourself a copy. Yeah. Grab yourself a copy. There's a whole plethora of information in there to learn about. So I also wanted to mention, folks out there, that we are lucky enough to have Claire joining us on our May 2025 tour. As many of you will know, or some of you will know, I co-founded a tour company last year called Simply Tudor Tours, and we currently have booking open for our May 2025 tour, which is Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens. And in fact, we're getting out of London and we're actually heading to Norfolk to immerse ourselves in the origins of the Boleyns. Of course, many people believe that Anne Boleyn was born at Blickling, that we've been talking about. And Claire's going to be joining us in Norfolk at Blickling, and also hopefully accompanying us to Norwich Cathedral, and we'll be able to go and stand in the places where some of these things happen. It's so exciting, isn't it, Claire?
I'm looking forward to it. It sounds amazing.
It's just great. And hopefully we'll get along to the local church. We'll go and see some of the brasses of the Boleyn family.
Yes, we didn't get on to talking about all of the brasses, but there are other brasses to see.
Yeah. So we're going to have Claire joining us. And I mean, it's a really extensive, immersive, it's a fantastic agenda. I'm very excited to go on it myself, which is always the marker that we have when we put together a tour. If we're like chomping at the bit to go, then hopefully it's a good one. So if you want to find out more information, of course, just head over to Simply Tudor Tours, www.simplytudortours.com, and from the drop-down list, you'll be able to find out, you'll be able to see the tour there, and you'll be able to find out all the information that you need. I think this one's an 8-day one, I think. So, yeah, we'll be going to, obviously, Norfolk, as well as some of the main properties around London, like Hever and Hampton Court, etc. But do pop along over to the Simply Tudor Tours website and check it out for yourself. If you've got any questions, you can always email me at sarah@the-Tudor-Travel-Guide, or our alternative address is hello@simplytudortours.com. Woo! We've covered a lot of ground today, but that was enormous fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It really was fun.
All right then. Okay, folks, just want to say thank you for joining us today. I know we had a little bit of a technical glitch in the middle, but I've managed hopefully to pull that together so that you've got a seamless discussion of Claire and I talking about the early Boleyns. And thank you so much for tuning in. All right, until the next Tudor Talk, it's bye from me and also bye from Claire.
Bye.